increasing salaries and or paying people having not done any work would take us on a road to economic calamity. At the risk of oversimplifying the matter, if you run a business, if you pay the employees that you have, you are a generous employer, but you pay them more than they contribute to your business, over time you will erode the capital base of that business and the business will go bankrupt. So there will be no business in the longer term. Now, in terms of countries, a country doesn't completely disappear, as you know, but if it's mismanaged in terms of the macroeconomic policies, in terms of, for instance, employing too many people than the country needs, paying them more regardless of the levels of productivity. You have seen, the structural adjustment programs of the 80s, early 90s on the African continent. The first thing that the World Bank fellows coming in with their briefcases used to do was to lay off people that were employed by government, because the governments employed more people than they needed. The people they had were not contributing anything to the gross domestic product.
Let me interrupt on that point.
I must say, Kholani, that a country is not a business. A country is not a business. And in the IMF report, even the IMF, the conservative IMF reporter says that non-financial firms, the industry firms in South Africa are highly profitable, with an average about 15% return on assets in South Africa. That's almost kind of a financial speculative.
Dr. Fasland, but what does it mean? What do you mean when you say countries are not a business?
There's no problem of profits in South Africa. There's a problem of wages, and the wages are a part of the national income. A country is not a business. We are speaking about GDP here. GDP is not gross domestic profits.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, but here's the issue. The issue is, as the DG raises this question, whether or not you should pay people over the productivity.
This is ridiculous. For 20 years, on the average, the real wage increase in South Africa has been 1 percentage point below the increase in productivity. It's just to examine the Reserve Bank figures. That is why the wage share of the national income is falling. That is an arithmetical fact. This propaganda or this hysterical campaign against unions that started, it seems that it started about 2008, 2009, when the unions managed to get some good wage bargaining contracts. But that is an exception.
All right, Mr. DG, I'm going to come to Tabi in a second, but Mr. DG, respond.
It's a corporation. It's a country.
Okay, Mr. DG?
No, look, I probably would fail to engage with Dr. Fasland because he takes extremes. Now, I did say that a country is not quite like a business. A country wouldn't go down and disappear like a business would do. But the point I'm making here, it's not even about union bashing. It simply says, yes, salaries can increase, and yes, salaries have increased in real terms in South Africa, and yes, of course, the share that has gone to workers versus the share that has gone to the owners of capital has tended to be slower. In other words, the portion that goes to workers than the portion that goes to employers. You also see that in the wide gap between the senior most, call it CEO, O's of businesses and the lowest paid worker, the gap has widened. That's a separate matter. All I'm saying, raising a minimum wage, if you do that to the point where it exceeds the contribution that people make, in other words, if you raise the wages without raising productivity, you are on a road to nowhere.
But again, Mr. DG, here's a quick one that perhaps government should do something about. He's talking about the vacancies in government. Employ people at least. Make sure that vacancies are filled in government.
Bolani, if government were to do that, this government would go bankrupt. If it doesn't go bankrupt, then it would end up having to tax people more.
All right.
Which in the current circumstances wouldn't make sense at all.
You have to tax people more in order to pay for the national health insurance.
Which one? Okay, Tabi, your thoughts?
Okay, I just want to address a few points.
Yeah.
So I agree with the caller that said that we need to invest more in an agricultural sector. We definitely need to use our land productively. We also need to rethink our trade link with Europe. A lot of our manufacturing sector is too reliant on Europe, and as a result taking a knock when there's a slump in Europe. And we also need to redirect our trade links back to South-South and even increase our Africa trade. On education, we need to focus on education. We need to focus on the right skills, equip students with the right skills for growing South Africa, for changing South Africa. I agree with the infrastructure drive. I know that the doctor said that he questions infrastructure as a means to economic growth. I think it's long-term, it's a sustainable drive. If you look at China, if you look at India, these two countries have embarked on a long-term infrastructure drive that started in the 50s and 60s. We just need to commit to a plan, a clear path, and commit to a long-term infrastructure drive. We also need more private-public partnerships in our infrastructure drive, and it also will bring together, and maybe there's a lot of disagreement between the private and public sector, and having more public and private involvement in infrastructure drive could also be a way forward. Lastly, on our productivity. I mean, if you compare South Africa with our emerging markets peers, our productivity is very low. And on government employment, we have our government is bloated. So we do have a lot of people in government, and with low productivity,
So, okay, 1.3 million. I'm going to go back to this point that you made now about the relationships between government and the public sector, because one economist actually said today that there's no platform for agreement between business labor and the government, government in this country. And I would like us to look at that in a minute. But let me just quickly go to Wiseman in Pretoria on the line. Wiseman, good morning.
Kwalax and your panel.
Hi, welcome, Wiseman.
The only point, or not the point, but one of the points that I think we need to look at as a country is this thing of capital flight. We allowed the capital to go out of the country during Trevor Manuel as a minister of finance. And I think it opens us up, firstly, that we've got capital that goes out of the country instead of being reinvested here. Secondly, an opportunity of crime. I mean, because it's difficult to separate which one of that capital flight is crime related, which one is not.
Sure.
That's my first point.
All right.
The second point is I think I'm just a little bit weary about DG's argument. That's the argument really that has been put by private sector to pay people fairly. Yes, he's saying now that the doctor is talking about the extremes, but that's the same argument, and that's the attitude. That's saying no one talks about how much profits is acceptable profits by the companies, because companies in South Africa are making extreme profit and at the expense of their workers in most cases. I would like him to comment on that.
All right, Wiseman, I thank you. Frank is back from Pietermaritzburg. Let's see if the line is better now. Frank, good morning.
Morning.
Hi.
Just a short comment I wanted to make was if you take how, for example, China has devastated our clothing industry in South Africa. Mm-hmm. I was just talking to a person that has opened up a business where he imports from China, and he was telling me he can't compete with the nationals because they get an 18% rebate on products that they export to a country that they move into. Now, we need to be looking at ideas where we can make ourselves more competitive overseas, similar approaches to that. But also another thing, I deal a lot with business people, and many of them started their business ideas when they were kids. We should make it easier for young people to open businesses, get the hang of working with it when they're young, and introduce them at a young age, and government support them instead of with all the legislation against them. So that was just the comment I wanted to make.
Fantastic. Frank in Maritzburg, thank you very much. Sebastian is in Cape Town. Hello, Sebastian.
Yes, I'd just like to comment on the DG's comments about that you can't raise wages because you haven't got the productivity increases.
Yeah.
That's arguments based on the assumption that wages are fair and fully paid at the starting point, and I think in very many sectors that's invalid. You're starting from a point where the wages are far too low, and until you actually get the wages up to a decent living level, I think his argument doesn't hold any water. Just on the point of view of increasing nominal wages to create demand and stimulate the economy, I think looking at nominal wages is not the right way to go. You have to look at the actual international purchasing power of the nominal wages, and in international terms, that still comes out very low. The only way you can really do things is by strengthening the rand, as George suggested, so that the international purchasing power of the wages will be increased immeasurably. Without strengthening the rand, we remain in poverty.
Okay, Sebastian in Cape Town, thank you. Let me read some SMSs. Somebody says, it is a lie and not possible because of greedy and corruption. We should expect more anarchy and hunger. Will this economy be able to pay highly educated hard labor? That's a question.